Good morning and welcome to this webinar from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm Nick Crawford, a researcher on the Geoeconomics program at IISS, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's webinar on strategic and security cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union. We began planning this event on this topic late last year when we were waiting to see whether the two sides would reach an agreement. And since then, the EU and UK have signed a trade deal, clashed over its implementation, argued over their trade in vaccines, and begun to set out their foreign, security, and defence strategies for the years ahead. So what might UK-EU strategic and security cooperation look like post-trade deal and post-pandemic? We have a fabulous panel of IISS experts to talk about all of this. Joining me are Professor François Eisbourg, Senior Advisor for Europe and a previous Director and Chair of the IISS, Dr. Bastian Giegerich, Director of Defence and Military Analysis at the IISS, Sarah Rain, Consulting Senior Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy at the IISS and author of this IISS Adelphi volume on Europe's strategic future, and Fernando Mogherti, a Senior Fellow for Defence Economics here at the IISS. The webinar today will be discursive in style. I will direct questions at our panel for roughly the first 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions from you, the audience. When it comes to asking questions, there are two ways you can do this. You can either provide a written question by using the Q&A function, and you can propose questions in this way throughout the webinar, and I will pick up on those questions in the final 30 minutes. Alternatively, in that last section of the webinar, you can also raise your hand and then ask a question orally. If you do so, we will unmute you, but please also make sure you've unmuted your own microphone. So perhaps we could begin by talking briefly about the general state of diplomatic relations between London and Brussels and between London and the various European capitals. The negotiations over the trade deal were obviously rather fraught. The UK's implementation of the trade deal, or rather its postponement of the implementation of the Northern Ireland aspects of the trade deal, have led the European Commission to lodge a legal complaint. And the wrangling of exports over vaccines has provoked all manner of accusations. This all gives the impression of rather difficult relations between the UK and EU at the moment. François, perhaps I can start with you. In your assessment, are these fleeting frictions that will pass, or are they symptomatic of a more seriously frayed relationship? And how do you think this will affect strategic and security cooperation between the UK and EU? Will it affect all areas of cooperation or just some?
The short answer is yes and yes. Yes, and it's structural. This is not simply momentary unhappiness. The vaccine thing in particular may indeed be a transient and may be forgotten relatively quickly. No, what makes this structural is the basic understanding, at least on this side of the water, that politics in the United Kingdom will continue to be fired up by Brexit and its consequences in a way which is deeply different from what prevails in Brussels in general and in the member states, in each member state in particular. Most people simply have assumed that Brexit is something that happened 5 years ago. It is very, very low down on the list of anybody's priorities in whatever member state and in whichever institution of the EU you are talking about. So there is this big, deep asymmetry between a British body politic for whom Brexit is quite naturally and understandably more important than it is to the EU. That what is even more important is that this situation is simply not changing. If anything, Brexit continues to be the equivalent of the proverbial third rail in British politics, and clearly is going to be so. Whatever happens around and in the United Kingdom will continue to be discussed and perceived as being linked up in one way or another with Brexit. And this is why it is going to be so difficult to be able to do anything serious about practically any issue between London and Brussels, and not only Brussels, of course, but the member states. We'll get to the other asymmetry, I guess, later on in our discussion. That is the asymmetry of interest between what appears to be relatively important to Brussels on the one hand is not necessarily what appears to be important to each member state taken in particular.
Sarah, do you share Francois' assessment of this as a structural problem that's simply not going to go away, and that Brexit thread within UK politics continuing to cause a deterioration in relations with the EU going forward?
Broadly, yes, but with a couple of sort of pushbacks, possibly. Firstly, I agree with Francois that it's many of these tensions that we're currently focused on are fleeting, and that, for example, we're getting a lot of focus on vaccine sort of nationalism, vaccine tensions, and not so much, for example, on things like small boat tensions between the UK and France, which might actually turn out to be less fleeting and more structural and persistent in terms of undermining serious security and defence relationships as we move forward. There's a whole array, as you mentioned, of things in the pipeline, the legal proceedings that the EU have launched, which could ultimately actually lead to the EU implementing tariffs against the UK. There's the ongoing pervasive mistrust that means that we're likely to see the dispute resolution mechanisms, for example, on issues like state aid, trialed sooner rather than later. There's the sort of accusations of perceived poaching of financial services in the UK. And all of this sort of leads to this attitude of sort of persistent frustration and mutual sort of assertive intransigence, if you like. But I would probably just sort of push back a little in two areas, maybe. One is that I would characterize the relationship more on both sides as one of competitive ambivalence, in that I'm not too sure that whilst the British media might be obsessed by Brexit, I'm actually worried that some of the political leaders in the UK government at the moment aren't sufficiently concerned by what the future of close relationships with our European partners should be. And so, for example, putting David Frost as the head of the implementation for the TCA, for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, you know, when he was slated to be National Security Advisor, I'm not sure if you had asked Frost his sort of top priorities, whether European partners and allies came close, frankly. And so that's something that I actually find worrying. And I think that there is, though, Francois was right, this sort of zero-sum tendency on both sides. So it's not just on the UK side, although it's absolutely clearly there, to point to EU failures and see, look, aren't we better off? Every opportunity to see this as a zero-sum approach. But I think it does go the other way around, because isn't it a little bit difficult for President Macron and for some of the other leaders where there is a serious anti-EU force domestically, if actually the UK is perceived to derive any benefit at all from the freedoms that it has won? And therefore, I think there will be this tendency to attack any sort of perceived benefit. And so just to finish off, I think there's one sort of saving grace in all of this, because I'm broadly pessimistic as well. And I think the sort of saving grace, if you like, is the wider world out there and the timeline of sort of ongoing institutional events that will remind us of the interest in cooperation. So just looking sort of forward, you know, in May, you've got the UK launching its multinational carrier group deployments with HMS Elizabeth at its head, and there's going to be a Dutch frigate. And you start to see sort of frameworks for European security and defence cooperation there. And then in June, you have the UK hosting the G7 with this sort of idea of trying to turn the G7 more into a D10 involving Japan, South Korea and Australia. And that's somewhere where you could see the UK and its European partners, albeit not EU institutions, but European member state partners, with common interests there. And then, of course, you have also in June the anniversary of the Battle of Normandy, the D-Day anniversary celebrations, where again, you just have these sort of common persistent reminders of what we have in common. And I suspect that events in Russia and China and elsewhere will continue to provide that. So, you know, a relationship of competitive ambivalence, but fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you see it, underpinned by an outside world reminding us of what we have in common.
I didn't want to get too caught up on the sort of current reactions to the vaccine dispute, but Francois, I wondered if you had any thoughts on the point that Sarah made about, is there a temptation in, for example, for President Macron to push back against any perceived benefits that the UK might be gaining from Brexit?
Yeah, before I answer that, just a very quick reaction on something that Sarah said, which is absolutely correct, but not necessarily fully relevant. And that is the issue of defense affairs. When QE goes to the South China Sea, this is something, of course, which the French are very excited about. But it's something which the EU is completely unaware of. That is, those issues on which there is strong resonance in this or that member state are not the issues which have resonance in Brussels. And that's the other asymmetry, which I was alluding to earlier on. And that is those things which are important to the EU, qua the EU, like the legal regime, like trade, like Schengen, are also the things which are actually not the most important for this or that member state. But on vaccines, your question is actually very important and apposite. Until the vaccine thing happened, my answer to your question would have been essentially no. What we had been seeing during 2020, during the first year of the pandemic, was a more or less the sidelining of anti-European, anti-EU populism. And you knew that something very interesting was going on when you heard Italian populists complaining about the lack of EU engagement in health affairs. That is, the EU was being criticized for not being sufficiently powerful, sufficiently present, sufficiently active in areas in which it did not used to have competence. So in effect, Brexit, which was in itself a horror story, which could be pointed to by the various European governments in the face of populists who were no longer particularly eager to try what the Brits had tried with Brexit. This was being compounded by the pandemic. And then came the vaccine kerfuffle. I mean, it's not simply the kerfuffle, it's the British performance. The Brits did overall, the Brits have done everything wrong in the pandemic, except in the one big area, which is the one which counts today, which is vaccines. The vaccines were present early on, administered early. The contracts, or the pre-contracts more exactly, had been negotiated early and smartly. The Brits have vaccinated half of their adult population, more or less, and the EU is tagging along at about 15 or 20% of the adult population. This registers, of course, strongly on public opinions. This is an issue which counts for people. And here it's quite clear that the EU's initial foray into health policy has been a disaster politically. It hasn't been convincing on its own terms, but it has been a disaster in political terms. The expansion of EU competence into the health field in the spring of last year has yielded exceptionally questionable results. Of course, we don't know how all of this is going to look in 3 or 4 months, but the fact is that the question that you posed, which had largely ceased to be relevant 3 or 4 months ago, has become relevant again. It's no longer simply a Brussels question. It's also, to some extent, a national question. It doesn't have to do with Macron's obsessions about the Brits. It has everything to do about European leaders' obsessions with their own anti-European public opinions.
Sarah, I can see you would like to respond to Francois. I also have a follow-up question for you before we then move on a bit to the defence cooperation specifically. But a follow-up question for you is, you mentioned that you're concerned that UK political leaders, officials and politicians are not sufficiently concerned with their relationship with the European Union and with European Union member states. What in particular should these politicians and officials be concerned about and be looking to do?
Okay, just quickly, just to sort of, I agree with everything that Francois just said on vaccines. I do think that if we're looking at this in a broader picture over what might happen and how the picture might shift in the next couple of months, there's room for the story still to change. So, for example, the EMA is the only regulatory body in the Western Hemisphere that has licensed 4 different vaccines for approval. So in the EU, in the coming months, you'll have in circulation AstraZeneca, as much as there is take up for it, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. You know, so there is going to be, and if everything goes according to plan, which is a big if, but less and less of an if as time is going by, the EU is going to receive 470 million doses of these approved vaccines by the end of the second quarter. So the pressure might well shift from the EU and its acquisition policy to, right, you've got 470 million doses, how are your rollouts going? And that then might become more of a challenge for member states. Now, member states like France, for example, are already stepping up now to that rollout challenge. So just a little bit of a caution that the picture might change in the second quarter, and that the debate, if we're having this discussion in September, might now have shifted to, okay, what are the acquisition policies that we're putting in place now for vaccine boosters against variants? So the UK, to me, already looks like it's doing quite a good job on this. It's signed, for example, a deal with CureVac, 50 million booster doses, just in case. It's being quite aggressive already in terms of going out and signing deals for the what-ifs of variant vaccines. And I'm not seeing the same picture on the EU side, but that's it's early days on that, but something to watch. In terms of what the UK officials should be doing, I'd just like to sort of distinguish between officials and political leaders here, because I actually think that there are officials in the ministries in London and in the embassies around Europe who are trying extremely hard to find points of common interest, to remind European allies and partners of, and look for any ways of cooperation. And perhaps it's something we'll get onto, but, you know, for example, this sort of proliferation of events about how the UK and the EU can cooperate together in the Indo-Pacific, that is in part sort of driven by officialdom sort of level that is desperate to try and get things back onto a less competitive, more even keel. I think the challenge really is the sort of the political mindsets at the moment, where the dangers of the zero-sum approach that I was talking about, I think, are still rife. And one of the interesting things, just to finish off here from my perspective to follow, will be the UK-France summit that, of course, was meant to be happening. Because the TCA hasn't yet been approved by the European Parliament, we're looking dangerously close to that being delayed now until September possibly. And then as soon as you're into delaying it until the autumn, well, from the French side, are you starting to get into the area where you might be delaying it until after the elections in 2022? We're not there yet, but it's a sort of example of how this sort of ambivalence, allows slippage on things that should be really fundamental and central to our relationships.
Let's turn specifically to the prospects for cooperation in defence and defence industry. In March, the UK government published its Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, its new Defence Command Paper, and its Defence and Security Industrial Strategy. Now, those three documents made very little mention of the European Union, focusing instead on NATO and on bilateral relations with EU member states. But given that the UK was always sceptical about increasing the EU's role in security and defence, this is probably no great surprise. Sebastian, perhaps I could ask you two questions here. Firstly, given this apparent disinterest in cooperation with Brussels, what will future defence cooperation between the UK and EU member states look like? And secondly, does the UK's sort of disassociation from defence cooperation involving the EU have any real impact on the EU's role? How do you expect EU defence cooperation to develop? Without the UK, will the EU take on a bigger role? And might that crowd out the UK's efforts to cooperate with individual member states?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think even after Brexit, to continue a little bit along the lines where we just were in the conversation, a defense problem that affects the EU's continental member states in a significant way would, in my view at least, most likely also directly touch on the UK's national interest and vice versa. So I think the reality is that there are really very few, if any, security and defense problems out there where less cooperation between the UK and the remaining EU member states is a positive idea by itself. So therefore, despite all the problems, despite the rhetorical bluster, the security of citizens, in my view, does not really lend itself to be used as a bargaining chip on either side, really, either the British or the EU side. Now, of course, that logic has been there all along, and still we haven't seen pragmatism reign. So there is obviously a deeper issue there. And with the UK leaving, the EU saw a member state depart that has one of the two largest defense budgets of EU member states, and certainly also on the defense investment side. The UK has shown its ability and willingness to deploy its military on operations time and again, perhaps not so much on EU operations, but nevertheless, and its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, of course, gives it considerable diplomatic weight as well. So in terms of revenue, personnel, a sizable share of Europe's defense industry is located in Great Britain, and Fenella will probably say a few more words about that. So it is obvious that theoretically the UK has much to offer to European security and defense, and the remaining EU governments would want to be able to draw on British experience, relationships, and assets. So pragmatism and common sense, allegedly British virtues, should be on display in security and defense cooperation after Brexit. So far, they have not been on both sides. I think the blame can be shared here. And you asked me specifically, Nick, about the effects on the EU as a security actor. I mean, well, put simply, the effect will be that discharging the EU's level of ambition for security and defense will be much harder without the UK. Building successful defense industrial collaboration, accelerating defense innovation processes will be more difficult. If the post Brexit defense relationship between the EU, or security defense relationship between the EU and the UK remains fractured. The EU would find it much harder to achieve whatever the right term is, strategic autonomy, because its freedom of action would be lower, its capability shortfalls would be higher, and its defense industrial capacity would be more fragmented. The UK, on the other hand, to me, loses an important collaborative arena for modern security and defense policy that crosses the civil-military divide, something that is at least a theoretical advantage of the EU as a security actor, and it would have to tie its fate much closer to the US and NATO. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a more constrained set of options. And I think the UK stands to lose defense industrial influence in the long run. And there is that risk of struggling as a middle power in a world of renewed great power competition. So I'd say maybe defense is not key to Brexit, but Brexit is likely to have significant consequences for European defense as well. So maybe I'll stop here for now, Nick, and we can continue. Yeah.
I'll follow up on the point you made there with Fenella. In terms of the impact on the consequences for defense industry, what do you anticipate those to be? What does perhaps the future of defense industrial cooperation between the UK and EU look like? And secondly, can I ask, I mean, the economic environment is challenging to say the least, with the fiscal impact of the pandemic and also the barriers erected due to the trade deal and Brexit. There are plans for the UK to increase its defence spending, but will there be an economic strain on UK-EU defence industrial cooperation?
Thanks, Nick. So on the first point, I think it's inevitable that some barriers or at least difficulties will develop. At the industrial level, there is still openness to European collaboration. Obviously, we have Tempest or the FCAS program, and the UK would really struggle to afford such a program individually. It would need to invest significantly in domestic capabilities to pursue that platform independently. So there's still that recognition that that collaboration kind of benefits all. But the recent defence and security industrial strategy that the UK released did comment that the UK's departure from the EU provided an opportunity to reform UK's kind of public contracts regulation in defence and security. There doesn't seem to be major shifts. There's no instant move towards demanding direct UK industrial participation, but the requirements for voluntary targets, for information about how UK content will be used in defence procurement, as stated in the industrial strategy, that's going to, I think, be hardened slightly and become more of a requirement. There's also these considerations of the social value that contracts will have, how they're going to benefit the UK supply chain and UK jobs. So it's bringing in that resilience picture. I think the legacy of development of common weapons systems, cross-border defence industrial consolidation does mean that the defence industrial supply chains is very much intertwined across the EU and the UK. So you do have that really strong starting point, that legacy. Several European companies that are based in the UK did voice very understandable concerns about Brexit to varying degrees of severity. Sort of Airbus was perhaps more vocal. The concerns stem from reduced access to skilled labour, R&D funding, fewer opportunities for collaboration, regulatory divergence. I think the agreements that are in place do try to allay some of those fears, but they haven't ultimately been able to take effect yet. And you may then have negative impacts where there's that potential rise in protectionist tendencies. European countries have identified those core national capabilities that they do want to protect, which we may touch upon later, but the UK has in the past been more all about sort of global competition by default. It was enshrined in previous policy. It was intended to keep UK defence industry competitive. So the move towards a more flexible, nuanced approach, where the impact on the UK's prosperity is going to be considered as well, and a move back from competition, that does imply that shift in competition policy, that slight move back towards protectionism, which, you know, I think could imply that there will be further challenges for cooperation if that pursues or continues on its current trajectory. The economic strain, I think the economic impact on Europe is severe from the pandemic. Obviously, the economic cost is substantial and it will have lasting impacts. But a further impact is that it's kind of masked what the economic costs of Brexit would have been, or benefits, depending on your viewpoint. But the likely costs of the increased barriers to trade would have been, we'll never have a like-for-like comparison. So that will make it difficult to ever measure the economic impact of Brexit. Beyond that, the economic fundamentals are really severe. Euro area outputs contracted by 7% last year, and quite low growth for 2021, around 4%. And the UK's economic projections are even more severe, so a 10% contraction last year. The recoveries in Europe are therefore lagging behind other advanced economies, and we did see what a protracted economic crisis did to European defence spending and defence cooperation after the financial crisis. So what's going to be really interesting is to see how that now impacts defence spending. We have finance plans from Germany that imply, after a sharp increase in the short term, largely because of the Eurofighter programme, it's going to fall back to trend levels, creating some pressures within equipment spending in Germany. The UK as well, there's a sharp jump and then a return to trend levels. And again, Italy, 2023, it starts to drop back again. So that seems to be the year where that crunch is going to come in. That's after this year where we're looking at really strong growth in defence spending. So defence was actually kind of ring-fenced or protected over the last year in the wake of this economic crisis. So as that starts to pull back, the impact on sort of cooperation can go one of two ways. The financial pressures bite, countries may retreat, protect defence industry, or find the mutual benefit in collaboration and cost sharing. It's really depends on how strategic, how forward-thinking these countries are. It's obviously very tempting to see nationalism as a solution, but unless you're willing to fund the full spectrum, you really need to work with partners. So in theory, that should limit the retreat somewhat. Thanks.
Francois?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with most of what has just been said. I don't think we're going to have a remake, though, of 2008, 2009, not because the economic situation is any better. Of course it isn't, but the geopolitics are definitely not the same. 2009 was the year in which we saw Joe Biden turn up at the Munich Security Conference announcing the reset with Russia. This was the year when Sarkozy sold warships to Russia. Whether or not there was an economic crisis was overshadowed by the fact that we were not actually taking the Russian factor particularly seriously, and the China factor didn't exist. That has, I think, greatly changed. And if the Brits stick to their budget commitments, if the French stick to their budget commitments in the multi-year spending law until 2025, things actually look pretty good for the defense sector, both in the absolute and relatively speaking to other areas. Whether we're all going to be able to continue as planned, I don't know. But the impulse is certainly towards increased defense spending rather than towards reduced or stagnating defense spending. So we're actually starting from a pretty good basis. Secondly, what does the EU do in the field of defense, which may be considered as important for its member states and for the United Kingdom? Once you've stripped away all of the language about CSDP and all of the PESCO waffle and so on, what are you left with? You're left essentially with two things. One is the European Defence Fund, and the other is the Military Mobility Initiative. And of course, I should say a third, which is space activities. Space activities, well, that's fine, since the United Kingdom appears to be discovering outer space as well. Military Mobility Initiative, it's quite important. And I don't know what is or isn't planned in terms of having the UK be part of that. It certainly would be useful for the British to be able to move their military kit within the NATO Europe space in the framework of the Military Mobility Initiative. And as for the European Defence Fund, I don't know how we're going to fit in the Brits. Someday the story will have to be told about how the Brits were sleeping at the switch when the EDF was set up. I have some unfond memories of speaking with one of your secretaries of state for defense during the Brexit negotiations, and he clearly hadn't been briefed about the existence of the EDF. It was actually quite stunning. They said, you don't want to end up like Papua New Guinea, do you? In terms of defense industrial relations between the EU member states and the United Kingdom. And then the third point, defense industrial cooperation, cross-border. Well, over the last 25 years, most of the action was either multilateral, like the Eurofighter or the A400M, or it was Franco-British. There was actually fairly little going on bilaterally between France and Germany. France and Germany, with Spain being added on, have put forward very great ambitions with the Future Combat Air System and so on. I'm personally, and this only commits me and nobody else, extremely pessimistic about where all of that is going. The future battle tank, the future combat air system, etc. And the value chains are between French industry and British industry. So pragmatism should be on display here. It certainly is not on display, or hasn't been on display until now, in terms of the EDF, which is going to be a significant part of the enabling of cooperation picture. And pragmatism has hardly been on display either in terms of how we're handling the various prospects for cooperation. I'll have other stuff to say later on the strategic.
Thank you, Francois. Sarah, you wanted to add something, I think. Oh, you're on mute.
2 sentences, basically, just as an example of the pragmatism that Francois was talking about. So his well-founded pessimism on the main ground combat system that the Franco-Germans are meant to be working up. And of course, one of the rare positive stories at the start of this year in terms of European defence cooperation was the signals that the UK is effectively getting observer status for this programme, and that there appears to be growing interest on both sides in what that might lead to in terms of more concrete collaboration.
Okay. Fenella mentioned that within defence industry, a slight move back to protectionism, or perhaps in perhaps certain strategic industries. Well, earlier this year, the European Commission published its new trade strategy, and central to that strategy was this notion of open strategic autonomy. But at the moment, the emphasis seems to be placed slightly more on the autonomy side than the open side, building up industrial capacity in Europe in various strategic industries. In March, it set out plans to capture 20% of the global market in semiconductors by 2030 and to have its first quantum computer by 2025. Kind of similarly, in the integrated review, the UK emphasised the importance of bolstering British science and technology base and strengthening supply chains in critical and emerging technologies. But in its approach, it emphasised also collaboration with other states and securing access to technologies developed and produced outside the UK. Sarah, I mean, these critical and emerging technologies are increasingly a priority for Western governments. What appetite do you think there is for UK-EU cooperation in these strategic industries?
Okay, I mean, I think broadly on the trade strategy piece, I mean, clearly the EU, the fact that it has put forward a trade strategy is welcome. The challenge, as always, is in the follow through. One of the other watchwords that it used alongside open, strategic and autonomous was, of course, sustainable. And that's somewhere where the UK and the EU both have common interests, but perhaps competitive ones in terms of the promotion of green agendas. But also notably, it described its trade strategy as preparing to be more assertive. And that means not just better promoting EU business interests, but also EU values and standards. Meanwhile, on the UK side, we're not yet totally clear what the new UK trade strategy is going to look like. But what I think is already clear is the priority is going to be on areas other than the EU, if you like. So you've already got the UK applying to join the CPTPP. You've got, no doubt we'll see a push for a bilateral deal with either and or Australia and New Zealand. We have to find a way to unblock tariffs on Scottish whisky and the general sort of problems around the Boeing Airbus competition, potentially even start facing up to agricultural policy. So there's going to be a lot on the broader trade plate. And the EU is going to persistently butt into it because of problems with the TCA and because of realities of closest trading and closest and strongest trading partners. But the focus of policymakers where possible is going to be elsewhere. So what does that mean then in terms of the strategic industries? I mean, I think the reality is that the last few years of uncertainty as to whether or not there would be a deal has already damaged, it has a legacy, if you like, of damaging cooperation in strategic industries, because there's an element of self-censoring that goes on when you don't know that there's going to be a deal or not, and you're putting together European collaborations. The tendency is to sort of play it safe, if you like. And you combine that trend with the trend to onshoring that you're highlighting. And you start to see, for example, in the small print of Horizon Europe, which is the successor program to Horizon 2020, you know, sort of carve outs basically in strategically important areas like quantum computing and space research. And so I don't think the picture looks particularly great at the moment. What I see is a lot of activity going on in these strategic industrial areas, these technological areas. A lot of it, though, is in parallel rather than in coordination, and quite a bit of it is going to be in competition, frankly. So, for example, if you look at efforts by the Europeans to break into the ion lithium batteries market, okay, so Europe has like 3% roughly of that market. And what you see is a big push by the EU institutions. So in January of this year, you got the latest tranche of funding, which was to 12 EU member states, supporting 46 projects by 42 different companies, all part of the Europe's Battery Alliance. And then the UK, of course, has its own sort of set of initiatives to position itself in the global battery market that's going to be worth some sort of $300 billion by 2030. If I'm looking for something positive to say, I'd probably highlight two areas. One is that to come back to Francois's point, that the EU is clearly not EU member states, and there will be strategic cooperations between the UK and EU member states. So, for example, the future of the UK nuclear sector. France has an absolutely crucial role to play in that, especially now in the December 2020 National Security Council. You've given the green light to Sizewell C, a new nuclear build station where EDF is going to be fundamental. So there will be, providing it goes ahead, and there are issues, of course, around China around this, but there will be big, grand projects on key strategic issues. And I think there's also, happily, examples of cooperation, and I'll finish here, which were already in the works, because remember, anything that's truly strategic takes years to put together and to come to fruition. And so there will be examples of platforms and projects begun in times before the Brexit referendum that will come to fruition a few years down the line that will remind and keep the sort of momentum of cooperation going. So, for example, there's this framework that is called Important Projects of Common European Interest, an IPCI. And basically it allows EU member states to work together where the market effectively is perceived as failing because the risk is too high. And the first IPCI on microelectronics was announced in 2018, and it involves France, Germany, the UK, and Italy. And the projects cover a whole range of areas on energy efficient chips, power semiconductors, smart sensors, advanced optical equipment. And that project is intended to come to its sort of initial conclusions in 2024. So you might sort of see that as an example of, okay, in 2024, we're going to get a whole set of first results with that collaboration, France, Germany, UK, and Italy, working on these areas. And can that sort of work be protected in a more sort of positive political environment?
Thanks, Sarah. Bastian, you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to get back to a couple of points that were made along the way. And Nick, I mean, you just said there's this open strategic autonomy, and it's more open, or it's less open than it should be, and the focus is more on the autonomy. I think that it's actually even worse than that. I think the problem is there seems to be a misunderstanding. The important bit is to always be strategic, and sometimes that means you need to be autonomous. And people are seeming to getting it the wrong way around. They always want to be autonomous and think that makes them strategic. And that is obviously the basic misconception, both on the British side. You can think of Brexit as one big play for strategic autonomy, of course, and on the EU side. And as long as that isn't solved, I think it'll be very hard to make progress on any of this. And I think Sarah made a very important point when she said, there's a mindset issue at the leadership level that is different from the shall we say working level officialdom, where some of these things get progressed. I would just suggest that the experience of the Trump administration highlights that you cannot make policy over time against the explicit will of your political leadership. At some point, the working level cannot carry it anymore. There's limits to this. So I don't have that much hope in just officials figuring it out. There needs to be more than that. The other point I wanted to make, and there are many examples of it, but defense industry is also one of them, is that while we're waiting for that better political climate, regulation is emerging that actually makes exactly the kinds of cooperation that were successful in the past more difficult in the future. And that is not going to get better with more time. And in fact, that divergence will increase over time and will make it harder to rein that back in the longer it takes. And just a final point, because Francois quite rightly pointed to EDF, space and European and military mobility as key elements. And of course, from a UK point of view, I mean, I would look at European military mobility initiatives as the key beneficiary of this is NATO, actually. That's what you will need to move large formations at speed around the European continent in crisis and in war. NATO does not have the money to invest in this. It'll come from EU sources, and it will go into something that is a clear benefit to the UK as well. So just a couple of points there to add to that defense part of the picture.
Okay. I'm aware that Francois wants to respond a little bit to Bastian, and Fenella may have some points to make on the strategic industries, but we should also pick up on some of the questions from the audience. Francois, while you respond to Bastian, I'm also going to ask you a question from the audience, which is there's a shift in the future UK strategy towards Asia Pacific, also seen among some European states, France and Germany, for example. Are there opportunities for UK cooperation here? And I'll also ask that in a moment to Fenella. With the increasing focus on the Indo-Pacific, do you see a probability for more defence industrial cooperation with states outside Europe on part of the UK, or indeed on the part of, say, France or Germany? Francois, firstly you.
Yeah, very, very quickly, just to rebound on what Bastian said about strategic autonomy, that people look at the autonomy part rather than at the strategic part. From an EU perspective, and arguably from a UK perspective, the strategic part should be about decoupling with China. And if there's one priority which emerges strategically, why are we doing this? We are doing this because we don't want to see China clobbering us economically, technologically, and in other ways, and even more unpleasant ways as well. I mean, the Germans remember how the solar industry of the EU was wiped out by China. So what do you want strategic autonomy for? You want it because you want to be able to decouple from China in those areas which you deem to be of particular importance. On military mobility, this is a very interesting case, and this is also why I was a bit disappointed in that aspect of the integrated review. And that is, the folks at NATO actually understand that there are all sorts of things which cannot be done without the EU in the field of defense in Europe. The regulatory stuff, which the military mobility initiative implies, is regulations made in Brussels, but Brussels EU, not Brussels NATO. So this is a perfect case of plus-plus, win-win, complementarity, pragmatism, you name it. And this is what you don't find in the integrated review. Asia Pacific, short answer, yes. There is plenty of scope. There has been for many years. The French and the British have been plying the same waters in Indo-Pac for the last several years. The French did their tilt, to use the integrated review expression, to Indo-Pac back in 2018. So do we have the same strategic vision? Yes. Do we have the same understanding of what needs to be done? The answer is yes. The ways of doing it, you look at the multiplication of 2+2 defense and foreign ministers meetings between the French and their Indo-Pac partners on the one hand, and the British and their Indo-Pac partners on the other. D10 was mentioned. Well, what is Biden going to do with D10? Well, it's going to be very interesting. Should we work together on that? Short answer is yes. And the last one, of course, is the Brits and the French and the Germans, who are also doing their tilt, should actually think hard about how we interface with the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I've been playing with the idea of a Quad Plus, in which you would have the Brits, the French, the Germans, South Korea, maybe New Zealand, as the outer circle of the initial Asia of the Quad 4 in Asia. Will it be difficult to talk about this? No, I don't think so. It actually should be quite easy. The difficult part, but not the most important part, will be to see how we fit in the EU into all of this, knowing that there is not going to be an EU consensus on this aspect of our policy vis-a-vis China. Many EU countries are simply not ready to do that. Thank you.
Fenella, your thoughts on defense cooperation, strategic industries, and perhaps also the intersection of those with the Indo-Pacific tilt?
Sure. So I think something that was interesting in the UK's industrial strategy was that those identification within defence of key UK capabilities to be provided wholly onshore, which kind of really clarifies which of the capabilities the UK is keen to protect and which are needed to retain operational independence, so they can be worked on with partners. I think in a sense that clarity is useful. It's useful for domestic UK industry and those seeking to sell to the UK. Onshore terminology is interesting. Specifically, it's not UK owned defence industry. It's recognising that there are companies within the UK defence industrial base that aren't UK owned. So stating that it's onshore recognises that there is that multinational element to the UK's defence industrial base. And again, it's similar to the approach taken on the continent, where there are those key areas that Germany, France, they're keen to protect domestically, and they're distinct from those that are less strategically vital and can be developed in partnership or even procured sort of directly. So in Germany, for instance, it's shipbuilding, armored vehicles, sensors, cryptology. And I think once those are identified, there is that theory, that clarity that you could get towards comparative advantage. Countries that do not have the financial scope can therefore, identify which countries they can work with, specializing in developing more competitive capabilities. It's quite idealistic. It depends on countries seeking to collaborate and cooperate on programs. But then again, you have the more negative approach. But I think that strong industry collaboration and intertwined supply chains and significant footprints does mean that retreat can only go so far. Like, industry does follow where the money is. Ultimately, on the Asia Pacific front or the Indo-Pacific front, I think industrial cooperation is a kind of natural progression from economic trade and the signing of the opening of the agreement with those 11 Asian nations. We'd have seen certain countries in the region turn to perhaps less traditional trading partners to look at, say, Japan and Vietnam. Their recent trade deal did include the efforts of China to remove or de-shore from China and to reallocate certain assets, certain productive capabilities within Vietnam. So that does create opportunities for those perhaps smaller markets that are strategically placed for the UK to invest in and work with, and also providing even further investment. Obviously, Asia is one of the sort of least affected regions economically by coronavirus. So in terms of defence budget growth, it's still looking fairly strong for 2021, with spending recovering fairly quickly. The economies have with some exceptions, already recovered. So those that are exposed to the strong demand of China do have that scope to increase spending as well. And there have been signals that these countries want to develop their indigenous industry. They want to invest in their defence. And there's also the security element where the countries kind of need to, and they need these newer capabilities, and the UK is quite well placed to provide them. So I think the fundamentals are quite positive for opening up those cooperation efforts between sort of the UK and Asia Pacific, and indeed France, Germany, who also have the capabilities that would be needed by these countries too.
We have several more written questions from the audience, but I do encourage anyone who'd like to do so to click your raise the hand in order to ask questions orally if you'd like to do so. But I'm going to pick up on a couple more of the written questions. And firstly, though, two questions relating to Russia, which was, of course, identified in the integrated review as the main hard security threat to the UK. Within the written questions, a couple here. One from James Wiley. How can the UK see the EU as a serious security actor given Germany's close economic and energy relations with Russia and Germany's persistent low defence spending? And relatedly, from Plamen Pantev, what best forms of EU-UK cooperation are needed and possible in view of the Baltic Black Sea line of confrontation with Russia? Perhaps I'll first come to Sarah on this, and then to Bastian. Sarah.
Sure, I'll do the one response at least to the German question, if I can leave the Baltic question to Bastian, if that's okay. I mean, in terms of how can the UK see Germany as a serious partner, or Germany or the EU as a serious partner on Russia, I mean, the reality is, of course, that if you look at EU sanctions on Russia, Germany's actually been pretty fundamental for holding the line and keeping the EU together on sanctions on Russia for longer and stronger than, frankly, anyone first expected. I mean, I think actually that question might be more apposite. I worry in a year's time. I do worry about a Germany post-Merkel and the likely successors and their potential attitude towards or relations with Russia. So Nord Stream 2 and Germany's peculiar and frustrating and maddening position on Nord Stream 2 has always been sort of so maddening because it doesn't actually fit what Germany is doing elsewhere on Russia with the EU, because Merkel is not naive about Putin. You know, the two are in regular contact. They look for areas of collaboration. So I do think there's some interesting stories emerging in terms of support for Sputnik vaccine. I mean, there clearly are, you know, strong ongoing links and contacts. But in terms of holding the line and being a good friend to Ukraine, corralling sensible sanctions by the EU, I think, you know, Germany, well, frankly, the UK owe Germany some thanks for that. And we need the dialogue to keep going, because this is one of the things that Francois know better than I do, but the sort of perspective in the Elysee that actually, you know, maybe it's okay to look for a partnership with Russia as the lesser of two strategic evils, because somehow that would break up the dynamic of in closer cooperation between Russia and China. And whether that's right or wrong, misplaced or accurate, if that's the dynamic coming from one member state, you know, it's been really important that Germany has actually, you know, at least found some pretext to challenge rather than to follow the lead that Macron, at least a couple of years ago, was offering in that direction. But I think looking forward, certainly, you know, there's real challenges for how the UK are going to continue to influence and cooperate with EU sanctions policy, and real challenges for how an EU sanctions policy on Russia is going to look when there is an increasing feeling that sanctions aren't really making any difference anyway to the Putin's regime's calculations, and that the next occupant of the Chancellery, if it is a CDU occupant, might actually be less strong on Russia. That's, of course, very, very different if it's a Green Chancellor, but that's a whole separate conversation about German domestic politics.
Bastian, would you like to add something perhaps on the Baltic Black Sea?
There are a couple of things I wanted to add. And being German, I'm going to give my own country a bit less credit than Sarah just has, because I do think there continues to be a willingness in a significant part of the political spectrum in Germany to seek partnership with Russia, where Russia has time and again shown that it is not interested in that partnership anymore. And at some point, one would wish that that has consequences. And I'm going to give a little shout out to an article written by our colleague Nigel Gould-Davis that actually just appeared earlier today in the Moscow Times, no less, where he argues that Europe urgently needs a geopolitical purpose, in particular in its relationship with Russia. And it's the weaknesses and the contradictions in the EU position that actually embolden Russia in various fields. And I do think that Germany contributes to that weakness rather than makes it go away, notwithstanding what Sarah has said, which I think is true about the sanctions and getting there in the first place and the centrality. I would also note that the way the question was asked makes it sound that is an EU-specific problem. I would argue NATO is not immune from such problems as well. It is. I would say it is the responsibility of these national level governments to sort out these aspects. I wouldn't. I would blame Brussels for the kind of the Borrell trip to Moscow, those kinds of things. But I think you know, Brussels. It's not everything is Brussels' fault. Actually, you know, there's something that national governments need to own up. So on the other question, let me tackle this in a slightly different way, because I think the point of the question was to understand how the UK might contribute to part of what would be seen as the European security contingency in the future. And I think the worry for a lot of Central and Eastern Europeans right now is that in light of the integrated review, the Defense Command paper, and a lot of other things, the UK has decided to set its sight on the far horizon to try and be on a small scale a little bit like the US in its multi-region presence, but it hasn't really answered the question of, if arrows go up in one area, where do they come down? And the worry is that some of these arrows might come down with regards to European security, and that questions of mass and military capability are increasingly left to others, while the UK focuses on a very, shall we say, exquisite, but perhaps less broad range of capabilities. And I think that is worrying. And so in that sense, I would think you have actually different geographies there. In the Baltic Sea, I would look to Germany and say, well, look, you are meant to be on this side of the ledger the most significant maritime power in the Baltic Sea. So fund a capability that does that. And I think then the other part of the question, it kind of created that arc to the Black Sea. Is that this yeah? There's obviously different geographies to bring together, and the worry to me is just that that sustained effort might become increasingly more difficult for the UK, given the direction or given the policy choices it has made, where it is a bit like a fruit machine. If everything lines up, you win big, but if it doesn't, you're left with very little or less than you put in. And I just don't see that the many documents that we have seen over the last couple of weeks really resolve that for the UK.
There is a raised hand, which I'd like to call on. Pia Hetcher, apologies for pronunciation if that wasn't correct. I think my colleague will unmute you, and then please do ask your question. You may need to unmute yourself. Okay, well, let's ask one more written question, and we can perhaps come back to Pia if we can get that to work. As Sarah mentioned, there are elections in Germany this year, and there are elections in France next year. I wonder if any of you have thoughts on these events and any other events that might change the direction of UK and EU foreign and defence policy over the next couple of years. Perhaps, Francois, I'll come to you first. Francois, you're on.
I was on mute. Germany first, the first big post-pandemic, hopefully post-pandemic election. Two assumptions. One, we have the more unlikely one is that we essentially have more of the same, except it will be without Merkel. So actually a rather weaker government posing more problems on the topics which have just been broached by Sarah and Bastian, notably relations with Russia. But this is a relatively familiar universe. The other option is the Greens come in, and if they come in, they'll come in fairly big time. It will be a big change. It'll actually be quite disruptive, but in several ways. The Greens in military terms, remember Joschka Fischer at the time of the Kosovo War. The Greens are quite military minded. They have worked quite hard on defense issues, and they would actually be in some ways more easy to work with on foreign intervention I'm thinking of Africa, the Sahel, maybe Indian Ocean, maybe easier to work with than the current team. Conversely, these guys are not enamored with NATO. They hate nukes. So it'll be quite difficult to work with them when it comes to issues implying closer working together with the Americans inside or aside from NATO. And as far as nuclear stuff is concerned, there may be some real difficulties here in terms of the extension of Germany's participation in NATO's nuclear missions, let alone cooperation with France. So a big change, but nothing earth-shaking. France is a different kettle of fish. There is no ready-made alternative to Macron. The left is in tatters, and the right seems to be determined to pursue its round of autoimmune disease, if I can put it that way. So the only alternative is the National Front, or what they used to be called the National Front, and that is still widely rejected. The one to watch here, and this is counterintuitive, is the usually not very important regional elections we are going to have in June. Last time around, last regional elections we had 5 years ago, the National Front hit the glass ceiling, as it has been for the last 30 years. And we knew from that point onwards that Marine Le Pen had essentially no chance in the presidential election. If that happens again in the regional election, you can probably bank on a non-National Front president coming to power. It could be Macron if he decides to stand again, which is incidentally maybe a more open question than some people abroad may assume. But if the glass ceiling is shattered in one or the other of the regions, and chances are that it will, because the extreme left and the hard right are not ready to work together this time around to block Madame Le Pen's cohorts, that would change the whole dynamic leading up to the presidential campaign. So watch, in the case of France, watch June.
Well, Nick's having a few issues. I'm aware that time is running out here, and that Bastien, you have to get off, don't you, at 11:15 promptly, and I'm sure all our participants have to do likewise. So unless he logs back on very shortly.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm back on, but I seem to have lost my video now. But thank you for stepping in there. You're right, we should indeed wrap up. But just before we do so, I'd like to flag that there is another event tomorrow from IISS on stability challenges in the Southern Cone in times of COVID. So that's on Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And that's at 3:30 p.m. Tomorrow, the 8th of April. This event has been recorded, and along with many of our other webinars, you'll be able to find it on our website in about 24 hours' time. Well, thank you very much to my panel, and thank you especially for coping there while my internet just completely dropped off. Thanks too to my colleagues working behind the scenes, to Ati Hamid and to Tom Wick. And thanks to all of you for joining. Goodbye.